And the first one is for Dr. Granger. The most useful and appropriate sample for antimicrobial susceptibility testing is a pre-treatment culture from an ill animal, not a sample that is taken post-mortem. This is a component of the AVMA judicious use guidelines. Will the NVSL revise its plan to be in line with this?
Yeah, the NVSL really doesn't have a plan for surveillance that goes beyond what we've talked about with the national survey work and the longitudinal studies. I think what this question refers to is the opportunistic samples that we would get from the National Animal Health Laboratory Network members. And in some cases, those samples would be collected prior to the treatment, and in particular, if the clinician is seeking that information in order to make a treatment decision. But it wouldn't be happening in every case, and certainly probably not part of our surveillance program. That would be part of the individual veterinarian's clinical practice, and the determination would be made there whether they would provide the laboratory with a pre-treatment sample or not. I think that whether they do that or not, on the clinical side, the information that we are able to access from the laboratory network about resistant organisms, if it can be coupled with some treatment history, and if we can see resistance as part of a pattern from a particular premises and then follow up with an epidemiological study of what antibiotic use patterns have been on that premises, that would be equally as useful as the preclinical sample might be.
Thanks. Anybody else want to comment on that? The next question is for Dr. Lewis. Could you define additional farm data, that's in a quotation marks, that FDA is wanting to collect on farm antibiotic use?
So we're currently seeking public comment on that in general. So and are going to revise the plans, and I think some of that would include the what data, what specific data. We sort of laid out in some broad categories what sort of information we'd want to collect, and but as was mentioned many times over, the devil's in the details. There's a few things that relate directly, if we think in terms of the specific needs that I talked about. One is measuring the effectiveness of Guidance 213. The other one is stewardship efforts more broadly. But if you just look at Guidance 213 and the changes that we're making, that really speaks to some of the information that we would really need to have, that relate to veterinary oversight, that relate to indication of use. So those would be some of the important things that I think are inherent to the initiatives that are currently underway, and information that we would need to have that would fall under the category of additional on-farm information, which may or may not be captured in the current existing on-farm information that USDA collects in a variety of different settings, as Dr. Granger discussed.
Thank you for coming to the microphone.
Sure. Kathy Talkington with Pew Charitable Trust. And a question for Dr. Granger and Dr. Lewis on the data that you're talking about collecting and reporting. I think you said 2017 was going to be the first report out of the integrated data that you're talking about from USDA and FDA and CDC. Is that right? 2017?
I think 2018.
Oh, okay. Okay, 20, sorry. So I'm just curious, in terms of, you all outlined some of the data that you already have that you're collecting and pulling together different pieces. So in the event that there is no additional resources available from Congress to enhance the data sets that you currently have, will you be then just utilizing the information you have for that initial 2018 report and making the assessments that the goals that you set out for evaluating 213, stewardship, and antibiotic resistance? So I'm just trying to get a sense of, in the worst case scenario, there's no additional resources for data collection, then what happens? Do you have adequate information from your perspective to make some of the assessments that you're hoping to do?
So sort of a contingency planning question, and I think that, at least to me, one of the the strengths of laying out the data that we're envisioning putting that we would need and that we would put into our public reporting. Many of the things that are on that list we already have, and many of them going back for a decade or 2 decades in some cases. So that's the good news. So even if we get no additional information, there is a fair number of those individual pieces of information that we have access to that we could put together and publish. I mean, we are reporting the sales data independently, the NARMS data independently. USDA is reporting in a variety of different sections the existing on-farm data and on use and resistance that they have. It could be conceivable that even with no additional on-farm drug use or animal health information that we could still put that report together and even without that information. Now, obviously, it would be better the more that we can fill in those pieces, which I think we've identified that we would like to have, and for the reasons that we described. But certainly it's possible to either continue independently reporting the different streams that exist, or even potentially to put them together in something similar to the structure that we described. Now again, this is in the proposal phase in terms of both the money requested to get this new information, the data collection side of the plan, but as well as the data reporting plan. So we're looking for public input on those 2 aspects that we put forward. So if you send in comments by November 30th, we'll take them into consideration on this next iteration.
Larry, do you want to respond for USDA, same question?
Yeah, I can respond a little bit on that. The National Animal Health Monitoring Systems surveys that I talked about that are national in scope and occur every 5 to 7 years dependent on resources, those are continuing to go on. We'll continue to do those. We've been doing those for a couple of decades now, and we'll continue to do those. And if we can augment the information that we're able to gather through those studies, those surveys, with information that comes to us from the private sector, from industry itself, from studies that are funded with our extramural funding agency, the National Institute of Food and Agriculture, and some of the work that's being done on farm with the Agriculture Research Service. When you end up getting all of that data and being able to put that all together, you can create a picture. Is it a complete picture? Is it as correct as it needs to be in order to formulate good public policy? That's another type of question that needs to be answered, and certainly when you do that, when you're in the business of regulating and you're creating public policy, you want to do that with the best information that you can have available to you. In the absence of that, then you make decisions based on what you know, and that's what we'll have to do if we can't get funded to do the more complete studies that we talked about.
Yes, go ahead.
So I have a question about, I think, Dr. Granger, you mentioned that all this data that you'll be collecting on this new survey will be a voluntary data provided by the farms. Don't you think there'll be a risk of bias there? Having the same farms reporting year over year, wouldn't it be better to do some type of randomized sampling across the country and try to collect that data in a more randomized way to have a better idea of what's going on across the board? And another part of that question is, when you collect samples, I know you mentioned probably those samples, you're not really know exactly what samples you're going to collect, but shouldn't it be better to collect animal samples and environmental samples at the farm level to actually have a better idea what's going on with antibiotic resistance?
Okay, well, in that question, we're mixing up different approaches to gathering information about the same question, which has to do with antimicrobial resistance and the emergence of that, and associating that with antibiotic use. So, yes, we'll continue to do the voluntary surveys with the NOMS system, and those are random and representative samplings across the board, and those we'll continue to do. What I was talking about that would be done with the same farm premises year after year or on a periodic basis is a different type of study design, the longitudinal study design that would help to fill in the blanks, the gaps in terms of the information that we need. So those are 2 different sets of voluntary participating participants, if you will, from industry, and they answer different questions according to a different study design. So yes, the random and representative nature of the NOM surveys would continue. The other thing that you asked about with the animal samples being collected and the environmental samples and so forth, that's part of the NOM survey. It could be part of a longitudinal study. It could be that we would target some of those inquiries epidemiologically and go to the premises after we get detection at the laboratory of an organism, a bacterial organism of interest, whether that's a commensal that causes problems in human health, or if it's a known pathogenic organism that we're concerned about, like the CAMP, E. coli, and so forth. And it depends on that participant to allowing us on farm to be able to follow up with sort of a retrospective study and then to look forward from there in terms of the effect of the management changes that might be made, knowing that we're there investigating that because we have determined that it's indicative of some particular problem with resistance. So all three of those approaches are different, and they have a different design, a different purpose in mind, but bringing them all together and creating a picture, a mosaic of what actually is representative of the true nature of things is our ultimate end goal. So. Go ahead.
Hello again, Heidi Ward, University of Arkansas. So in light of an announcement that was sent out a couple of weeks ago from the National Association of the Boards of Pharmacy, it's been recommended that human pharmacies now have access to veterinary drug formularies. So it's been a big question that I've had to field from producers, knowing with the veterinary feed directive on board, when injectables are going to come under regulation as well for veterinary oversight.
So just to clarify, Guidance 213 focuses on the feed and the water routes of administration. We know that there are at least a few products that are available that are medically important, that are the same classes that are affected under 213, that are available through other routes that are non-feed and water injectables was mentioned. Our current plans for exactly when and how to follow up on that are under development. We're not there quite yet. We really want to make sure that we get these changes implemented that we've already started, and to build on that progress and continue to reassess. So we are aware of those remaining products and we'll be looking to that in the future, but I don't have any more specific information in the short term.
Okay.
Go ahead. Good. Come on down.
Yeah, I would actually like to follow up the question about bias in the sample, because all of the mechanisms are voluntary, and it's potential that you're missing a group of producers that decide not to participate. I remember I didn't actually attend the FDA public meeting, but I remember I did look at Jim McDonald's slides, and for the NAS surveys, you had basically 60% of the producers, I think it was in the poultry, decided to answer the antibiotics questions. And I think he also found that there was a bias for the smaller producers and maybe I remember that he noticed there was a bias in the size in terms of who was answering the question. So I think just because you have a representative sample of the farms that are volunteering, and it is have a number of farms that make it a representative sample, it doesn't mean that you're actually sampling the complete population. So my organization, the people, the other organizations I work with are very concerned about that. And one approach that we thought is that you don't necessarily have to do voluntary sampling. You're already considering doing at least with the FDA at the feed mills, looking at investigational samples. But you could also do a random sample of your population of feed distributors. And I was just wondering, have you all looked at that as a possibility, as a way where you don't have selection bias, which you always have for the voluntary ones? You might have a guy that knows he's not using antibiotics, how you would like it, and so he just decides not to answer questions.
So I guess the question is related to bias. I guess my personal bias is that in a scientific approach involves there's always bias. So, and a scientific approach means that you state your biases up front. As was pointed out with a voluntary sampling or anything that is short of mandatory, there's a selection bias is one sort of bias. Essentially mandatory sampling of the VFDs is another sampling of approach with its own set of biases. Now that's really restricted to the feed use drugs, obviously an important subset of the drugs, but it biases you against the most critical classes of antibiotics that exist. And some of the compensatory changes that we might be worried might come from restricting the feed use, that injectable use of fluoroquinolones and cephalosporins go up. You're not going to catch that. That's going to be a bias of the VFD sampling. So I'd say that our general approach is that we're looking at all options, and we're evaluating them in light of the inherent biases of each different approach, what it gives us and what it doesn't give us, and ultimately how feasible it is and what's the cost benefit, the value of that information that we get in light of its stated biases. And how much effort and it would take to get us there. So yes, we're considering all the different options on the table and trying to formalize what the biases are for each of these individual things.
Yeah, I would just add that in terms of the question about bias, that that's the business of statisticians to be able to take that into account before conclusions are drawn. And that's what we'll attempt to do when we do the sampling. And certainly, as Craig has said, there's different kinds of a bias, whether it's a selection bias or a sampling bias. We deal with all of those with whatever study design we're looking at the issue. And so I think that that's the business we're in. Again, what we're trying to do is create as complete a picture as possible for the information that we need. And as I said in the slideshow, it's not a quantitative measure. That's not what we're seeking from every individual farm in the country. I'm not sure that would be any more useful if the sampling is done correctly and the conclusions that are drawn are statistically significant. I'm not sure that we would gain any more information, but we surely would increase the resource need if we were to do that.
Last question from the floor. Let me just say real quickly, Dr. Park is not here. He had to rush back to CDC. When somebody from CDC tells me I have to rush back to the office, I get a little nervous and hope it's not something I'll hear about on the evening news, but we'll all tune in tonight and find out. Last question. Thank you.
I think a good example of what can be done is the study that Dr. Hofker described yesterday, which was a broad representation within the poultry industry on a voluntary basis. We were reassured of its confidentiality. I think the data that he presented represents a substantial portion of the issues that have been raised here and could easily be modified to include some more. That is an approach with which we are already comfortable. I would suggest that you probably pursue it further on the poultry side. The mechanism is already in place. The second question that I would ask goes back to how do we assess the public health outcomes attributable to the reduction or control of antibiotic use in food animals? This has been a pet interest of mine for some years. We've lost access in the turkey industry to some 5 classes of antibiotics and therapeutics over the last 30 years. I have yet to see an assessment of the public health impact of those actions. And I'm very concerned about how that is going to be addressed going forward. So how are we going to evaluate the public health impact?
Great questions. I think, but not easy ones. I think otherwise all the people that have been wrestling with those issues across the world and across the decades would have had an answer by now. But and I think the exercise that we have started here in this meeting kind of speaks to one way to approach that. We included in my presentation here this morning, at least as a discussional item in this report as we put things together, how we would relate their observations on drug use in the context of animal health and demographics to the observed resistance trends as another avenue to do that. One other mechanism, and this may be a shameless plug, but we also, as we initiated the effort to collect additional data and to look at our reporting needs to provide greater transparency about these issues, at least on the animal agriculture side, we realized that there There really isn't an agreed upon, even conceptual framework for answering the question that was asked about associating those two things together, particularly with this complex mechanism with different species and so on and so forth. I think Dr. Solomon has said a few times that resistance may be the most complex problem that we're dealing with. It involves every living thing in the planet, and I think that really belies the complexity here. Well, we while we're initiating these efforts to seek out additional data and report it, we also partnered with the National Institute of Mathematical and Biological Synthesis, NIMBIOS, NIMBIOS. We set up a working group to see if we could come up with a framework to analyze that relationship. And this group is essentially a convener of mathematicians and biological oriented folks to try to tackle these issues. And that's captured in the President's National Action Plan as with a 3-year milestone to propose an analytic framework for doing that. Now that's in some ways a bonus or a parallel track because, as you know, we are pursuing seeking additional data, even in the absence of a clear framework or even a proposed framework for how to do that. So I guess all that to say that we're trying to tackle that in a number of different fronts, from a more subjective discussional setting, putting these things into context with one another and talking about it, seeking out new analytic methods, conceptual approaches to try to relate those two things together, and all of this is a work in progress. So if anybody has the answer and they're keeping it secret from us, please share.
Okay. We're aware of the work that Dr. Hoffaker has done, and there are folks that are in academia that have done work similar to that in other animal species, guys like Mike Apley that was here and talked to you yesterday, Peter Davies, Randy Singer working with the poultry industry. Those folks have all visited us at the Center for Epidemiology and Animal Health and talked about the approach, the scientific methodology for analyzing the data that's collected. There's a lot of work to be done yet to know exactly what the best methods are to collect the information in the first place and be able to analyze that. And part of the modeling effort looks at that question too with NIMBIOS. As far as the relationship then with animal origin bacteria that cause human health issues, there's a lot of investment, I think, that's necessary in the laboratories where these isolates are examined, and if we can do more in the way of genomics to be able to characterize them as completely as possible and look for whether they're exactly the same organism or not, and whether there's an epidemiologic association that can be drawn, the more information that we can gather, the more informative we can be to the models themselves that we're working on. And then as we develop those models to understand what the reality is, we can look at intervention strategies that make sense.
And I just want to echo Larry's thoughts there on the need for kind of genomics or metagenomics. That's something that our task force identified as one of the priority issues. And also, Lonnie King being our co-chair, having worked at USDA and CDC, having the crossover knowledge of how both of those agencies kind of approach this issue, we think that there's room for universities to play a role as a convener for both industry, agency, and so that's the goal of the kind of university research organization that the task force envisioned, having a dedicated, sustained public-private partnership that can facilitate some of this work.
So thank you very much to our panelists. Thank you for your presentations. Thank you for